So I was thinking maybe I don't need to go into this story, and so then I deleted a lot of the initial attempts, but they weren't really something I would use. It was just a lot of where you're trying to unearth what you're trying to get to, and so you have to kind of get the flow going. Let's see, where do I start with it? I was starting to realize as I was kind of telling this strange story that I had gone through, transforming the way that I see things and shifting into another way of understanding, challenging views, into what I had started to explain it as is just seeing through a new plane of existence, like looking at the components. And so I have to remember it'd taken years to kind of get me into this whole shift of thinking along those lines. I mean, I think it also, though, is just a way by which our minds grow and learn throughout the years of development and growing up. We shift into different perceptions, just like the example I'd given in the past where children, infants grow into certain stages, and then when they get to that stage of crawling and whatnot, they start to shift into depth perception. And prior to really shifting their mind into that stage of growth, there's times where, if you had children, then you have to watch them because they'll just crawl right off the couch or something, and they just don't quite have that depth perception. And so then eventually they develop that, right? And it's part of their development. So this is that's an example in a larger sense as we grow along our stages of life, that it seems like as we grow into our maturity and adulthood, we start to have that transformative experience. Along those lines, though, my growth years, I kind of went on this, I don't know, I guess I call it my spiritual journey, what have you. But I was just receptive to there's all these occurrences that I had. Long story short, though, they functioned to get me to understand that I didn't know certain things. I mean, that seems obvious, there's stages of our growth. We don't know things and we grow into it, but it was different in the sense of, at the time I had spent a lot of time thinking about spending time in prayer and, all of these other long story experiences. I eventually had these dreams and multiple things that were kind of getting me to explain that a huge barrier in it was that I didn't quite have a breakthrough in perceiving things from a different framework. And so I remember having this one dream, and one portion of the dream was there were some of us sitting in this classroom, and there was this teacher at the front. I couldn't really see their head, their face, and this happens a lot in my dreams where this entity takes on a certain form and I never fully see the fullness of them. And so it kind of facilitates the ability for me to not focus too much on the person. They're kind of just they play a role in the dream, but it's not as though I'm thinking of specifics to attribute to certain ones. So anyway, there's this character at the front. Well, also what's interesting about it is that he's playing this role of a teacher, but then the perception shifts later in the dream, and then he's this angel being. And I still can't see the fullness of him, just portions. Anyway, though, when we're in the classroom setting and he's speaking to us in terms of our understanding, he's making all these shapes and these things on the board, and I remember looking at it, and our hearts are kind of receptive, and we're kind of seeing a little bit and kind of vibing with it a little, and then but then there was this felt sense of not quite getting it. And so then I go to the front and I'm standing next to him, kind of like teachers do, where you're trying to work out and question, what is this, da-da-da-da-da. So I'm standing next to him and I'm just looking at it. And so one of the main, among various things, what I kind of then realize is a main point is realize that I'm looking right at it and I don't get it. Like, I don't see it. I just can't yet perceive it. And so I finally say to the teacher, and I just say, I just don't understand. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to understand. I'm looking right at it. You could be telling me the thing, and I just don't get it. And so then he does this pointing like finger to me, kind of like, okay, now that we've established that, because it's almost like we're not even speaking the same language in a sense. And we're trying to understand, like, bridge these worlds, or whatever. And so the main point is that I get that I don't get it, kind of. I mean, that's not just the main point. Like, a part of the main point is to understand what the thing is, but to understand I just don't get it, even if it's right in front of me. And so to start understanding that, like, what you're in now, how you're seeing it, needs a shift of understanding it so that we can even begin to try to reconcile, like, these requests and what you're seeking for, and da-da-da-da-da. So then once he kind of, like, he kind of points at me like we're in this, like, trying to figure stuff out between each other. And so it's kind of like if you've ever tried to talk to somebody, like in the marketplace or somewhere where they're obviously speaking a different language and you're not speaking the same language. And so they're pointing at things and they're making references and they're doing body language. And you're just like, okay, so are you trying to go here? Are you trying to do this? Are you trying to do da-da-da? And then when you kind of make a gesture that they kind of understand, they kind of point at you. And I've had this occurrence happen to me in like throughout my life at certain times where I'll meet up with someone and I'll be trying to help them, like in the store, or whatever. And they'll say like a few things here and there. And then once you get portions of it, they'll like point at you. And it's like this gesture of like, yes, okay, that part. Yeah. So that's what it kind of felt like. And so when I was with this person, and it was kind of like first established that you're looking at it, you don't get it. You're in this understanding of things and you don't get it. So I'm like, okay. So then there's this kind of relief of like, okay. And then he does this arm sweep over this imagery that we're looking on at the board. He does this arm sweep and the whole thing disappears. And then I'm standing with him on the side of this mountain and it feels so real. It's like we just transported into this other imagery. We're standing on this mountain and I could kind of see there's this like parts of these pine trees by me. And then I can look out and I see the rolling hills and the rolling mountains. It looks kind of similar to what I'm used to. I'm not trying to see the whole story, like the whole dream here. But anyway, and then it kind of gives me a pointed reference of this direction of things. And then this like building kind of lights up and whatnot. There's like more to it. And then there's also this like, I don't really want to say village. It seems more than a village. This place down in the valley that kind of seems to represent, I'm trying not to get into the whole dream here. The main point that I'm getting to, though, is it shifted what was on this kind of like formula on this board into this like real life journey. Long story short, though, what it did, this was several years back when I was first starting on stuff and I was having all these multiple dreams. Initially, I would think, does it mean to like go there, to go to this place? Where is this place? Is this a literal place? So initially it kind of facilitated getting me to just keep my eyes open on out there. Like there's other things I need to learn. I would for years then kind of make it literal a little bit. Like I wonder if there's a place, is there somewhere I'm supposed to go? But over the years, there was always, another place or another place beyond the hill or beyond the horizon. And so what it kind of did though in practice was there's multiple things I could draw from the dream, but initially it just got me into this journey. And then through the journey and development, and I had to kind of be receptive to the spiritual connections and stuff, I would get little bits and pieces. And it was as though God in like seeking to meet me in my prayers and seeking to understand religion in this transformation, I was then drawn into saying, first, accept you don't know. First, you need to understand you're in a framework where it's not the right way of looking at it. And so you're not quite able then through that to get to these other things. And so join me in this journey. Let's go in this life path, and let's go through this process of getting bits and pieces here and there to start trying to understand things differently. So I have to remember that. I have to remember that that feeling of all these years where I'm trying to shift into this other framework of things. There's going to be these different responses. There's going to be people that they're so sure that they understand what I'm saying because it sounds like this other way of interpreting things, and then I'll keep going back and saying, no, that's not quite it, da 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 da. And then there's some that they're not getting it, or over the years, people that have followed me, they kind of understand where I'm getting to, and they know how to play the crowd by drawing them into the wrong framework and the wrong interplay, and they kind of distract people from what they otherwise could be doing in this transformative path, and they're kind of instigating the wrong tensions. And it seems like on purpose, because there's different ones that had followed for years. So anyway, so I was thinking about this, and I was like, I had started to share this story that I had made comparisons to about how did I start learning some of these things and what was kind of the life journey of it. It's just there's just so many things. Like I said, it's kind of almost been 25 to 30 years of stuff in and out of different experiences. Just, that's not far-fetched to say. That's what everyone does in our lives. We evolve over the years of our lives. We evolve over the experiences, and then our perception, and, that's just a regular thing. It just so happens that my desire and what I felt drawn to through those stages of change was the putting in the forefront of my life the question of, I wanted to understand. This was my request. In some ways, it was drawn out from me. It was an inescapable part of just my life, that I had to come into terms with, is do I just live in some other perception, or do I work through these things? So it's kind of one of those things, though, like they say when people are talking about manifesting. I know there's a lot of different interpretations on manifesting. I also tend to challenge just the idea of manifesting on its own, because I had also talked about this before, where if you start learning the way the mind works and the things that we focus on and draw attention to, of course it's going to call to mind the capacities of our reasoning and the way we think about stuff. It's going to create more focus on that. That doesn't even always have to be like a superstitious practice or whatever. It's simply just, even in study tools, they'll talk about that in educational circles, where they'll say, for studying, you need to understand how the mind kind of works, da-da-da-da-da. Sometimes you expose yourself to certain content. So they'll talk about this with studying for, say, a test coming up or something. They'll say, if you're approaching a topic that you feel overwhelmed, or there's just so much there to think about, at least start with exposing yourself. Get the textbook, get the information, look at the imagery, flip through the chapters, read the titles and the headings, skim through the sections. Don't overthink it. Don't just settle on being overwhelmed by the content. Just expose yourself to the content, and then something about the mind and reviewing some of the definitions in the text situates the mind to start drawing into, and almost in a sense computing those and doing kind of a scan or a search, and then sleep on it, and then do more of that. And then what you'll find is that your mind then, when you do things like that, when you put in these requests for computing or what have you, then the mind will draw from the files and the reservoir of your experiences and try to figure those things out. And so a lot of times then you wake up and you have an epiphany, or you understand it more, or you think, I don't even know how I started to understand this more, but like, because something about also when you sleep, you kind of get out of your way, like the portion when you're in your waking hours that has all these other things that you're filtering, whether it be survival and a lot of input, is at rest. And so this other part comes out, and then it just is reasoning through all of these things. So you wake up, you have an epiphany of like, oh, I get it more, da da da. In some ways, I think manifesting is kind of like that. There's other areas where people in the world, they utilize the idea of manifesting to simply just try to focus on something that they want, and they don't do the spiritual reasoning of how does this fit in the whole network of things. Like they don't do the spiritual surrender of like what God's will is for your life. It's kind of like that I think it's some old country song or something where the lyrics say, thank God for unanswered prayers. The things that I focused on, I realized I shouldn't have gotten because I didn't know any better to think of the next thing or how it would affect my life. It was just like an isolated request. So sometimes I do think like manifesting can kind of be like that. And that's why it's important to surrender into this practice of like, what's God's will for my life? How do I surrender this to God? And then God help me to have the proper desires for my life, blah, 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 whatever. There's a lot that goes into that. So anyway, though, I tend to think that sometimes the requests that we have, then we set in motion, like you go through those stages of, okay, this thing is surfacing. There's this unresolved aspect of my life. And it like I've surrendered it to God. I've sought God's guidance, but it keeps coming up, right? So then you can kind of find, well, is this like a spiritual responsibility? Is this something in my life? Is this also a part of universal value, seeking for the truths of God pertaining to your experience and all these other things, right? So I do think at some level, some of the things that we begin to see throughout the progress or the evolving of experiences, we are situated within systems and within experiences where it facilitates forming our awareness of what do the needs seem to be, how do we get out of the previous conundrums or blockages and whatnot. And so in some ways, like we all have that. We all have like the gauging where the times are, what is the unresolved portions, what is our further responsibility, and that kind of thing. So I do think that kind of happened in my life. And I just so happened to call it out, I guess, eventually. In some weird way, like, I shouldn't say weird, but like in some aspects, though, I do feel like I didn't just on my own want to do that. Like it just was an inescapable part of my life. The perpetual question of things and how do we navigate for the future and stuff like that. But I do think once we draw those things out and we start to name them and we do spiritual seeking for, okay, here's the thing, God, I surrender it unto you in this process of like, because I don't want it to simply be like a fixation, but there's this thing, and then you kind of process through it and you spend time thinking about it. It does kind of remind me a little bit of like Solomon. They talk a lot about Solomon's kingdom, where the result of things happening in his lineage, then eventually when he is situated with this leadership, then he requests, like, God's like, kind of, what are you seeking for in terms of this responsibility? And then he asks for wisdom, right? He asks for certain amounts of wisdom. And then there does become, because that portrays some of the desire and what he's seeking to manifest, because he wants to have wisdom to be able to build and develop a proper system, then for a certain period of his legacy, that's what was kind of on the forefront of like what he was like cultivating, right? He was participating in developing those skills, and so then he was known for that. Eventually, though, other factors that he's not processing accurately become part of what eventually is on the other side of eventually the erosion and collapse of things going on. Anyway, long story there, thinking about Solomon's kingdom, because there's a lot of different stages of it, the rise and the fall and like the ripple effects and stuff like that. But anyway, so it's kind of one of those things where I'm just kind of spending a little time thinking, how do I start introducing some of these eventual, because it's been years and years and years of situations that I had like gotten into and experiences I had, things that were even like not even a part of what I even expected. Like I said, eventually I started to develop over years through different stages of things. And as you're evolving and you're getting involved in the societal conversation, then that absorbs into it. And so I eventually get into what I call systems theory and systems, kingdoms, and that way by which I would look at scripture and think about some of these things. And then the transformative value of what this means in terms of existence and life and God and whatnot. So I'm kind of thinking about this and I'm imagining to myself, how do I explain to people how I had gotten to the point of discerning the times, I guess you would say, or attempting to, right? Like none of us are perfect and we're still relying on God for guidance and life to be this perpetual evolving and learning. So on some level, I'm trying to think how to help relieve because what I'm seeing, so the concern that I'm having is people getting caught up in maybe misinterpreting what I'm about or fighting the wrong battles. But at some time, I just think it's not always like fighting the wrong battles. Like, I also have to remember that when things shift as a unit, a whole system, people are going to be fighting different necessary battles in different areas. And so I also don't want to get in the way of maybe the portion that they need to be a part of. And so this is where I'm just kind of spending time thinking about it. And so it kind of reminds me of, there's this parable, and I forget exactly how it goes, or where it originates from. But there's this parable or this story, and I think I'll just kind of do a summary of what I remember about it. And I think it's something to the effect of like, there's this village, and they can't see. I think it's something like that. They can't see. And so, or there's this group and they're trying to describe like this elephant, and they're trying to describe what an elephant is. And so some of them have their testimony and they're saying, like they could see, like they have access to certain parts of the body. And they say, like, this is what an elephant is like. They describe maybe like the muscular body in relation to like carrying these like massive legs, or something like that. And then some are like, no, an elephant is like, and then they describe maybe like the tusks or something like that. And then another one says, no, an elephant is this, that, and the other, like, this expansive, like, has this, like, massive back or something. I don't know. So anyway, though, like, the gist of the story is that they're all describing the elephant, but there's, like, these different perspectives, right? And so in some instances, when there's these different perspectives, there's legitimacy to it. And so you don't want to get into saying, no, it's not this, that, and the other, or whatever. But you look at it and you think, what's the shared aspect of this experience, or whatever. I've also heard people say in the past, like at times, spiritual movements and stuff like are going to meet people at different places. And so you got to just allow those different phases to participate in the way that they're starting to develop, and not overcorrect it to try to be just a exact duplication of your perspective, or whatever. So I'm kind of in between these things of like, how do I kind of discern direction for what my experience is, but then also not getting in the way of these other like helpful forms that are emerging and whatnot, because things emerge in like a unit or system shifting, right? Because that's how we are as beings is we are a part of these like societal units and stuff like that. So I'm thinking about that among so many other things lately that I'm thinking about. And I'm trying to explain, like, how do I help discern between, how do I discern between explaining this shift of this different framework when my intent is to kind of be, or to articulate how I'm thinking about things differently in a different framework that will manifest differently, or in practice possibly be that which is the change that we're seeking for, but the language and the use of it sounds so similar to the mechanisms in the previous framework that I'm trying to get away from, right? So I'm thinking about this, like, how do I start explaining this? So this is why I also did talk about, I introduced the idea of systems theory, because the thing is like some of the battle that I had found myself in over the years that kind of culminated, and I didn't expect this, was that over the years, as things in the past had developed in the social media era where there was a lot of activism, I had previous accounts and blog posts and other interactions, and it snowballed into something beyond what I, like at the time I was like, what's happening here? So I had taken a break from some of that stuff because it had created interaction and what seemed to occur between different signaling back and forth of stuff happening on social media. Anyway, in that environment, I then became exposed to what became known as like the new religion, new atheist movement. At the time, there were a lot of different religious contributors that you wouldn't really say we were all on the same page, but they were resisting this new atheist movement. Long story short, then I got into this scenario where I was like, okay, what's happening here? Because it felt like every other attempt to merge with religious contributors and whatnot, the doors would just be shut. Even if I would try to network in like other churches and other groups and other, like, the doors would be shut. And so I had spent this time thinking, why is my whole life focusing on this like atheist movement? I didn't think about this. I don't know that I was prepared for this, but in retrospect, I remember someone in my like younger years saying, because I was spending time thinking like, when I went through that introspective years of my life, I was like, what is this thing stirring in me? And I'd go on long walks and I'd kind of cultivate it and think about it and whatnot. And it started to become these topics of culture, religion, and stuff like that. I also at the time started to have this like deep stirring for just these other parts of my life that were very, I guess you would say, theory oriented, philosophical. Why is this way? Why is this that way? What's the function here? What is the mechanism that produces these behavior, blah, blah, blah. And so I went through this stage where I was doing kind of like self-taught philosophical stuff. I was studying religion. Like, it's kind of crazy because I didn't really think when I grew up that I was that studious in that sense. I just started to go through this phase where I was just like a curious person. I guess it was like a philosophical side. Like the whole, like, why are we here? Why is this like that? What is like, da 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 da. And so then I started to, during that time, read like various different contributors, and I was even exposed to some theories of like atheists and whatnot. And I would kind of get this feeling that when I would enter into these domains of these discussions and stuff, that it was like I was entering into this very old, ancient domain of conversation that so many have contributed to. It just felt very, I don't know how to explain that. I don't know, like it just, I guess you would say it kind of felt like finding or tapping into a deep interest of mine or something. I hesitate to say that because then it makes it seem like I'm supposed to really flourish and show some great skill in that area. But anyway, it is just me kind of talking through, this is what my experience was. I was really interested in it, and I remember telling someone at the time, because I had spent these young years thinking like, what is, like, when you're in your 20s, you're like, what is like the calling of my life? What is the thing I'm to spend my life on? And I was just kind of cultivating that. And it just kept coming up, like these topics of like religion and like institutions and stuff like that and philosophy. And I remember telling someone, like, I think I want to study like religion and culture and stuff like that. And they're like, you got to just be cautious of that, because if you go into kind of like the institutions that teach those things, you're also going to confront this massive battle that's just there as well with like atheist movements and stuff like that. And I was like, yeah, I think that it was just a caution. At the time, being young and kind of growing up on the res and stuff, I wasn't really exposed to that level of those types of institutionalized historical conversations on that level, right? But when you think about it, there's truth to that. There is a lot of, like, that's a battleground, right? And it's not one of those things where, it goes through all of these things now that are starting to develop in what I'm finding myself involved in, whether it be economic theory, political theory, which goes back to people that make reference to these things, whether it be communism, socialism, in reference to world history, geopolitical politics, demonization of other groups, or suggestive of like pursuits of God or religion or secularism, all these things, right? It's this whole institutional, historical transition of these like beliefs and practices, and like I said, in a sense, kind of like a battleground. So interestingly enough, as I'm tracking all these things throughout my life and I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, oh yeah, I had spent years just starting in on like, okay, I have this interest, I'll start in on it. And I started reading all these books, what have you. I was getting exposed to some philosophical ideas, and then I was exposed to, like, on a smaller level, this certain particular atheist. And I didn't know at the time that much later in this major stage in my life, because I kind of brushed it off. It was almost just like a little inclination, years in my early 20s. And so here's where I'm like, do I kind of tell the story, try to explain it? But anyway, so I'd done a lot of the previous work, setting the stage for understanding religion and all these other things. And then this thing kind of exploded online. And I was like, oh, I think I'm kind of finding my people, my like certain religious movements and stuff that I feel like I could kind of vibe with, and we can have these conversations and da-da-da-da-da. And to me, it seemed like a straight line of like, this seems like something that I should do. And this is where it turned into this whole other thing that became very expansive, and then situated me into this other dynamic that I just, in retrospect, I could see how it was kind of written in the path of things, but I had just not even expected it. I just didn't think that for myself. And so I had, during that social media interaction of things, found myself situated in this whole, like, what they were calling the new atheist movement. And it was kind of this battle for the atheistic approach on the world stage. And here's the thing, there were some decent things about it. I could reason through some of their approach to things. One of the characters that was kind of leading the influence, I had remembered was this book that I had stumbled on, that I had purchased earlier in my 20s. And then I just, eventually, it just wasn't the time to read it. I took it as somewhat of a challenge at the time. And then I forgot about it. I had gotten rid of the book. It never quite took. So then here I am all these years later, and it's this character. And I think, oh, I've seen you before, like several years earlier in my early 20s. And it was right after. So for those that are like around my age or like older, they remember like what was happening after 9/11, the years after 9/11. There was this palpable tension of religion, and there was this tremendous development of like anti-Islam sentiment. And it was like emerging a lot of this militaristic fervor and a lot of these different religious perspectives and whatnot. And it was also kind of portraying how this thing being kind of like unearthed in America was also just very unreasonable. Like there was this, like we're supposed to be this melting pot, this diverse nation. And there is some of that, but it started to make everybody kind of afraid in the streets of everybody and all these, like anyone that looks different, and racial profiling and all this stuff. So people probably remember some of that. And so there were these books and these contributions coming out after that where, so at the time it was like people were incubated in the Americas in this comfy, cozy lifestyle. And it just started to kind of pull that back. And then, people just were not aware. They were just kind of believing in what people were telling them about geopolitical foreign policy, and they, would sell this story about this is why we're going to war with this group and that group. And so it was just, like most people like didn't have time in their everyday lives to research, is this true, and so we had other groups that were developing, that were doing investigative work and saying, is this true about like foreign policy and these interactions? And so this was all kind of under the surface growing, right? That was kind of the climate of things kind of going on. And at the time I wasn't among the group that was hugely involved in like the political dynamics and whatnot. I was doing religion and living my life. I was young. I was developing my life, a young family. But then years later, after I'd kind of gone through so many other things and I was situated and kind of being exposed here and there, and I was familiar with some of the religious rhetoric, and I was branching off from what was happening within, at the time, what they were defining as kind of like a Christian nationalism. There's different approaches to that. There's a lot of generalizations here. I'm just trying to do like a basic summary of like getting to the point here. And so I was at the time not like, there was a lot of tension between, there were groups that were really intensifying their approach to like the militaristic role of the U.S. in relation to Christianity and all of these things in relation to foreign policy and the warfare approach that the war machine, I guess you could say. Unflinching, that's God's call, that's God's way, that kind of thing. And I was among the group that was saying, like, we don't think so. Like, we're looking at this and we're trying to analyze things here. And so it's kind of all of these factors, right? Very complex. In the midst of it, though, then there's this atheist movement going on where they're like, their approach, to be oversimplified, but their general approach was like, we are going to fight for the preservation of Western civilization, a lot of similarities with what the militaristic Christian right is doing, but we're kind of this democratic movement that we're going to fight for, like, this was their claim, right? Like human rights, the preservation of this world system, Western civilization institutions, the supremacy of our role among the earth and the nations and negotiating between the nations. And then they offered this moralizing argument because their claim was like, we're not negotiating with religion anymore. The book was titled End of Faith. The character that I'm making reference to is Sam Harris. Sam Harris is like one of the world-known atheists, right? They were being labeled. So the atheist movement at this time that was growing was right, like the fervor right after 9/11. And they were just like, we're done. We're not negotiating with any, we're done with religion. So they were kind of taking on all these like religious debates and whatnot. And they're like, kind of like, we got it from here. This is going to be like going forward, like the preservation of like the civilized free world, or whatever. And also we're done with religion. We're getting Christianity out of the way. And he also was debating Judaism and Jewish scholars as well, like done with Judaism, we're done with Christianity, we're done with Islam, da-da-da-da-da. But what he then was introducing eventually, and at the time, I didn't know this at the time. I didn't know he had this other spiritual side to him. Was, basically, this was the framework. This was kind of like drawing the line and saying, these are some of the approaches that we're taking. So I found myself then caught up in this and thinking, like a lot of this sounds like there's some stuff I could agree with. Like I read the book that he wrote to like Letter to Christian Nation or something like that. And I had so long story short, during this time in my life, so I feel like I'm catapulted right in the middle of this atheist movement. The people leading the charge and excited about this atheist movement coined the phrase the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And it's a play on words from scripture where in the end times, like the 4 horsemen usher in the apocalypse or whatever. And so they're saying like Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins are like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the atheistic movement that is going to like crush religion, whatever. And I'm not saying that they eventually, there's a long story here. So this is kind of what I was trying to think, like, do I address this or how do I, kind of get into this? So I found myself kind of thrown into this like atheist situation. In retrospect, it makes so much sense that this would, if I really truly was looking at transforming religion and culture and these like aligning the system with corrective measures, it makes sense that I'd have to be confronted by one of the leading, at the time, like entities, like in the fullness of their critique and their proposal and their framework. So at the time, I just didn't think that, though. I was just like, well, I can connect with these other characters and we can develop and formulate a good argument. And we, it can kind of develop into like the religion proposal and the atheist secular proposal. And we can kind of like seek out a consensus, or something. So initially, when the social media stuff happened, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to connect different ones. I really didn't want to have a platform for myself. I wasn't seeking to be like the face of anything. I was trying to get these characters together. It turned into all of these other things in the mix of it, which maybe were kind of useful because it kind of like develops these other side narratives and whatnot. Maybe there is a little something to it. It's not like I can't talk about it. I'm not trying to hide any of it. It's just that it'd be distracting to go into the little side narratives. It's just, there's so many complexities that were developed into it. Like pertaining to those things, it's not like I have some major things to hide or I'm not like trying to deflect from it. I'm just trying to like keep the same, like the storyline of the emphasis of what this is about as to like what it's about. But it kind of got into like all this religiosity stuff, all of these other things going on. During that time then, the different movements. So what's strange about it is when this movement started, it was very much just the Democratic Party, the left-leaning. And a lot of these movements were all left-leaning. Like even the religious groups, the new religion versus the new atheist, and they would kind of have these playful, not playful, but like legitimate like discussions developing and whatnot. So anyway, I'm thinking I might go into talking about that. What was that experience when I kind of got dropped in the middle of this like new atheist movement? I spent this time then reading a lot. Like I tried to read. So at that time, I tried to catch up on who are these characters. So I watched some videos of like Christopher Hitchens. I kind of liked some of his approach. Like there's some things I liked. He's a rascally character. There's some things though where he's very abrasive. I wouldn't say that I disagreed with everything that he was proposing. There's plenty that I did disagree with. So there started to become these signaling back and forth. I started to have this like pushback, this animation of pushback within this movement. So like, here's the thing. maybe I'll post this one and give this intro, and then kind of go into how it started to become somewhat of a friendly encounter with negotiations within this new atheist movement, but it also started to connect just numerous other things. I do feel like life kind of situated me in that. I had started to spend a lot of time reading Sam Harris's books and becoming familiar with his take on things. I started to realize that a lot of, like, when I'd read his critique of religion, he critiques religion based on the framework by which we've all been generally given, the framework by which a lot of groups critique religion and interpret it. It just so happens that life had prepared me to challenge that framework, and so the interpretation that I'm drawing upon the situation is from this other shift of things. And so then I would start to realize, okay, this kind of makes sense that on a world stage, the battleground of the world and whatnot, this global season of things, as is accounted in, when I was making reference to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, that I had this whole story about confronting and kind of being imparted in my life in this whole interaction. He documents and he kind of bookmarks in that speech, remaining awake through a great revolution. He portrays the systemic efforts, right? The battleground for the systemic shift of things. And he talks about we're at a stage like a global network, basically. The world is now a network through modern innovation and whatnot and technological processes. We're a network, but we're not yet shifted into a type of spiritual brotherhood. And so it kind of really got into my mind those several years prior as carrying on the legacy of what that internal transformative approach is within this world system, this world network. So then later, through a lot of development, I'm then catapulted right in the center of this atheist movement. In retrospect, then I recall confronting Sam Harris's book, End of Faith, and the claim that they would start situating the end of religion and setting up this, quote unquote, improved world system, right? Accounting for all of the things, debating all of the different contributors. And so I find myself right in the middle of this, right? And I'm thinking, steep learning curve. Just so happened at the time then, I'm brought into, like I said, it's peculiar to me because I'd always generally strategically been like left-leaning and for the Democrats. So I find myself right in the middle of this whole range of Democrat contributors, whether it be the establishment, the label that we're now giving that, like the establishment, progressives, different ones. And at the time, people are very much anti to like the Republican right and the Christian nationalism and all of these things. And at the time then it starts to become apparent that for some groups, Sam Harris and different ones, like he's their fighter, right? He's the one accounting for all of the things and accounting for the critique of the entire thing. And kind of portraying it all as functionally an atheistic proposal of God, that there's not really anything about God. It all functions within the domain of world power. And so I'm kind of looking at this and I'm thinking, all right, where's like the remnant of God? Where's the spiritual distinction here? And so I'm kind of reading his book. He has this, so there's this claim, right? There's this book that he has, The Moral Landscape. And so one of the things that he had to develop through these like battles, right, is the battle for the westernized world system had various factors within this whole system. And some of it was trying to make amends for the quote unquote corrupt religious past, which there's some truth to that, right? The benefit of the supremacy of the Western institutions, which also groups claim, right, in terms of their arguments for Western development. The increase of women's rights as like morally superior, human rights as morally superior, the just war theory and their justification for the battle of the enemies of this system. And among other things, the justification and the reasoning for the benefit of the economic powers and defense mechanisms and whatnot. Among numerous things, right? And so here's this situation then, and it's like, what's the religious like approach to this? What's the argument in terms of a distinction here? Is this it? And so I spend time thinking, like, in my heart of hearts, can I say that a world given over to this atheist movement? To be fair, eventually they become a little bit friendly. There's a long story there. So I'm not trying to just villainize them 100%. I feel like that's where there becomes an error, is when people don't discern between and they try to fully attack something and they don't piece apart the portions where there's some truths, because if you can't see some of the partial truths, even if it's weaponizing partial truths with omission or whatever, or selecting for, it still becomes like an error for your argument if you're not seeing what that is and drawing it into a part of the portions that you need for your argument. So I had spent this time thinking, looking at this and spending time thinking about it and reading some of his books and studying some of his like arguments for the moralizing of his stance. So, because eventually what it kind of came to was he was arguing a lot of these religious contributors, some of the like world-known networked religious contributors. If you follow some of this stuff, then you're familiar. There's all these different religious topics, these massive, if you're kind of in this domain, you know the arguments of, he critiques scripture. He also critiques like conquest narratives and how it can't be attributed to God. So there's so many things that are just very similar to what my argument is, but there's this distinctive shift of what my actual argument is, where I still preserve the spirit of God and that component of God in the portions that we see within religion. And so I find myself over the years having to, it's a high standard. It's a high standard to follow the atheist movement because it's like unflinching, it's unapologetic, and it wouldn't stand the test of time to have very surface level approaches to, well, God can do what God wants, or God could do, like, you have to see the whole function in the light. Like, you have to be able to preserve portions of what is in the text by going beyond the text and what are the functions of life, because it goes really deep into this critique. What also happens, though, is that, so there's a lot here. I'm trying to explain where I'm getting to. They don't believe in some of the religious arguing points. They allow the religious arguing points to be there to select for whoever they need the pressure of their enemy to be, to preserve Western development. What I mean by that, as an example, is Sam Harris eventually had said in the strategic, basically I'm paraphrasing, in the strategic approach to things, he will side with Israel and Israel, the enemies of Israel, he will side with Israel against the enemies of Israel, because that preserves the Western civilized system, right? So inevitably he can both say, because his standard by which he justifies this is, in his moral argument, he'll say, Israel is more moral than Islam. So if you oversimplify it, there's Western civilization, the preservation of, say, the U.S. and its networked allies, geopolitically, economically, within war, conflict, and preservation. And there's what he calls, like in the moral landscape, a hierarchy of morality. So it kind of goes into just war theory. He claims that they're like in the path of it, his conviction, because he also has a standard by which he seeks for truth, right? Because it's this battleground, it's this long battleground of who's going to lie, who's going to be dishonest, who's going to do this. And so it's like, it almost is kind of like a cosmic spiritual battle for like who's going to corrupt the stage of this like progress, right? Who's going to like distort and corrupt truth, right? So I'm under the surface, over the years, I started to like, I probably have to unpack that a little bit. I think I'll get to this. I think I'm going to start just talking about this because this is where it seems to be developing into, like, I can't escape explaining some of this stuff in terms of the systems theory. Over the years, it started to seem like people were kind of tapping into an animation of things. And so eventually it becomes unearthed that he admits that he does have a background within spiritual, kind of what you would call spiritual practices. It was kind of surprising to me eventually because he didn't always lead with that. It was like in the backdrop of his practices and whatnot. And so along those lines, in some of his practices, he has this high standard of, he wrote this book called Lying, right? He has this standard where in some ways he does believe in attempting to be honest and have this certain moral compass. In some of his beliefs, then he does think that he is offering trying to stay in step with what is true and what is the stage of progress. And as this interaction started to happen over the years, initially this wasn't the case. Initially it was just the trade of words and stuff, but over time it started to seem as though people involved in this started to realize there was an animation of intersecting happening. And in that, we almost seemed as though we started to recognize whoa, there's certain forces aligning a lot of our interactions. And in that, we don't stay within the path of progressing in honesty and what is truth and tapping into what is the moral compass here. There's these strange shifts and things that are happening. Over the years, I feel like it started to intensify people into realizing whoa, something's happening here. Even the atheists and the religious groups, to where they started talking about this battle of what is consciousness, what is spirituality, and in the midst of it, how do you hold space for what is spirituality, what is the moral compass, what is the truth, what's the precipice of staying in step with the truth. And so it started to turn into this strange animated force of interactions and interplay. So this is why eventually I'm thinking, now that it's kind of reaching this point, how do I introduce this strange occurrence that seemed to happen? So he has this book called Lying. It's pretty interesting. Like I said, there is some things that I would somewhat agree with. I had spent time trying to hear out his moral argument because I had also been in this tension within religious groups where I just didn't, they couldn't seem to get past trying to justify the conquest narratives in the same kind of way. And if you recall some of the religious debates where it's Alex O'Connor debating some other religious scholars, they still try to just say, well, they try to have the arguing point for, well, God is just almighty and God can do it what God wants. And if there's a claim for conquest or a claim for taking people's land and, the word of God, then that's their argument in some ways, right? Other people, myself included, will say that just doesn't quite add up. That doesn't attribute to a just God. There's something else going on there, other interpretations, long story short. And in light of some of these, it did seem like Sam Harris's arguing point gained ground, his the moral arguing point. So if you watch some of his stuff, I would still be left though with thinking so at the end of the day, there's various things I just don't agree with. with Sam Harris's arguments, and I did feel like he does the work of trying to stay in step with where the revelation and understanding, the consciousness of shared belief is in step with like the progress and the precipice of increase of understanding. This is why I had recently said, in following and seeing the things over the years, when he kind of is getting ahead of this, because there's a under the surface moralizing battle going on, he's setting the stage for now, because he had previously been in support of Israel. At the time when I had even said in the past I was trying to negotiate between Israel and different ones, and there seemed to be promising opportunities for negotiating between groups, but then it was just like not really taken into consideration, and those efforts were sabotaged. And so there's a lot that could be said about that as well, in terms of it not always really being this language or this story that we're told in the public that Israel's trying to seek for negotiation, because through these measures you would see that they weren't. This was a battle for, like, in some ways you could say what seems to be supremacy or this world connection in relation to this system, right? And in that now, the things that are coming out and being made public about Israel not really having a moral argument, because before the moral argument that Sam Harris had in terms of the preservation of the system and all of these other things and justification and being in step with the progress of human rights, and just kind of it was basically a debate, like winner takes all. Who's going to win the system? Where does the system shift? Who understands what this is, in the debate arena? He was pretty sure that he was producing the moral argument. And so this is why I said recently, with some of the stuff that's coming out, that the way I read it, and now that he's kind of explaining that if it turns out that Israel is practicing certain things similar to like Islam, because his systemic framework was, he was one of the supreme leaders in the world that was very much anti-Islam. And that would be his justification for foreign policy, geopolitical connections, strategizing the economic system, and all of these things. I do believe that some leaders within Israel looked to him as like their directing of decision making and whatnot. But now that he's kind of seeing that there's these things coming out, being unearthed about what, like Israel, what seems to be eroding their ability for this moral stance that they're taking, I look at it as he's getting ahead of it, because there's this, like I said, there's almost this animated force where people are trying to be in step with preserving the connection to like Western civilization by having the most supreme moralizing argument. So I think that he's trying to get ahead of being ready to abandon support for Israel, because these things are coming out, and he's trying to stay in the consciousness of understanding among beliefs. And I think the scales are kind of tipping to where he's realizing there's not, it's starting to look like there's not a moral argument in case for Israel in that respect. And so we're kind of at these interesting times where even like some of the most supreme belief systems are shifting, and so we're trying to seek like, what does that shifting look like, and the connections that are associated with it. And so people are seeking for, what's the moral argument, what's the truth here, what's the precipice of the understanding, so that we stay in step with truth, the strange intersecting of animated forces pertaining to that. So this is kind of what I was trying to like introduce as to like the context by which I'm having to say things that sound similar to other belief systems, other frameworks, other approaches, and it kind of leaves me vulnerable to being misinterpreted. And there's been, what I'd noticed over the years is my content and whatnot gets construed in a way where I had felt something strange was happening, like shadow banning and other things before people were even using those terms, where it does kind of keep me in this like isolated echo chamber of things. And it's peculiar because, I was just trying to like get ahead of things, and ultimately I was looking for universal values and this shift and accounting for some of these things. And it just felt like I had these other mechanisms that were kind of stifling the ability to do that. Eventually, though, I just kind of had to come out and just start saying what I needed to say to some extent, and just not worry about the false perception out there and whatnot. So this is why I also had made that statement where I said, if we're looking at a moral argument, if we're looking at transparency, at that, in that same way, I'm not even really being given like a fair footing in that sense, in terms of what it is, what it is that we're attempting to kind of make reference to, right? There's a lot of other justifications that people will make claim to, and statements and safety measures and other things along those lines. But something that I had also noticed, and I kind of wanted to make reference to as I try to talk myself through this, and I think maybe I'll call this, like, I didn't intend to get into all of this. I was going to start talking about, I think I'll interweave it with, I wanted to start talking about when people are making reference to the socialism, capitalism, stuff like that. That's what I was kind of spending time with, but I thought I need to talk myself through some of this stuff and kind of explain this a little bit. What's kind of difficult is that people are talking about just looking at the moral compass of violence, which is incredibly important. We want to look at violence and de-escalating and having better, safer societies and whatnot. But what I had kind of found, this peculiar method, I guess, part of the method that is used I had noticed with Sam Harris in his argument over the years, is he utilizes connection to what we call like the feminine, I guess. I'll have to break that down. I'll have to explain what I mean by that. And so I think even though people are focused on what seems to be these obvious provocations and results in these results in these hostilities that kind of break out in the public and whatnot, then people, it creates like a tangible thing that people point at and look at and make reference to. But what's this other kind of very entrenched other dynamic that's being utilized in this is these other forces, right? These other influences that are that lead into these influences, and it's difficult to get society to differentiate between this. And it's this function of utilizing this aspect of the Western civilization to moralize and justify their arguments based on their claim that they're ushering in a saviorism of the feminine and women and women's rights. But it's very much associated with these other factors within the feminine and women. So this is why I'm saying I think I had to talk about this and try to attempt to articulate it, because when the battleground is made to look as though the moral compass is based on what they point at and look at and generate in terms of these hostilities, and then they formulate a defense like in step with that based on certain justifications, it's as though they can kind of produce that type of argument by whether it be inferences or setting the stage or producing and maximizing the potential for death traps and other things. And then we're not really getting into like a spiritual breakthrough as to what's really going on, like what preceded setting up those conditions. And so we're kind of at that stage where we're trying to understand the moralizing argument associated with these certain like human rights, and is this really human rights on a systemic level, or is it creating conditions that are selecting for those things and putting people in those positions where these are the arguments that they're formulating. So as an example, during this time I started to realize that, let's see, maybe I'll save this for the next one, but basically I'm going to go into or try to articulate this when it shifted into pitting me against what were these claims of women's rights and the precipice of women's rights and sexual freedoms. And then those mechanisms were being utilized within the establishment Democratic parties to go in and undermine other groups and set the stage for these moralizing arguments of expanding this like system of things. What's really difficult to differentiate there is because there should be certain attributes that are a byproduct of increased freedoms for women and all these things. And so it kind of sets you up against where it's like, I'm not against women's rights. I'm not against certain freedoms. I'm not against certain approaches for like sexual freedoms and whatnot. But this mechanism and this method that people are trying to resolve and places their proposal for these freedoms are very much tied to these other occupying forces, these other limiting mechanisms that provoke and generate a lot of these hostilities, right? So this is what I'm trying to talk about, the differentiation between a spiritual movement and breakthrough, spiritual revelation, and the difference between what has become attached to and connected to within these still present dominant world forces that we see in this battleground of things going on. So this was my story, how I got situated into this atheistic movement. I even tongue-in-cheek, like it became a little bit playful, so I'm not trying to like, here's the thing. I think truth and like the revelation, the spiritual revelation and truth should win out. I'm not looking for people to simply just go in and try to like attack other one. Like that's not what I'm looking for. Like when you get into whether it be debate or the exchange of ideas, what like people that do these things really want is this shift of truth, right? The battleground of it, and of like the battleground, they say, of the mind, of switching and shifting what is true, right? And so if you really are in that integrity of what this shift in these debates are, you have to be ready to say, okay, if I'm confronted with something that's true in the heart of hearts of like a system of truth all the way down, then you have to, be like, all right, God, is this a revelation that I simply just need to accept, or what's true here? To summarize, I just don't think that the system by which Sam Harris functions through in his moralizing arguments, even if they're selective arguments, even if in some portions there's some truth there, I still just don't in my spirit believe that it's an actual imagery of what truth unto God in the spirit of life really truly is. And so following this, then it does cause me to have to, like I say, like I have to be able to critique things through the scripture, prior to the scripture, what is life in reference to it. So I've done those things throughout all of these years. And this is just a summary of the things that I've been involved in, where it's kind of come head to head on the world stage within things pertaining to social media, world debates. You could spend your time reviewing some of the arguments. There's going to be probably things that people are going to agree with, that they concur with in the atheist movement and maybe in the religious movement. And then here we are in the world stage trying to figure this stuff out. So anyway, this is an introduction to this stage of getting involved in critiquing and reviewing and researching the atheist movement as pertaining to my own spiritual contribution on the world stage. So anyway, here we are.